Welcome to Faith Connections. We gather here every week for the purpose of connecting our faith to everyday life. And that has never been a truer statement, and I've probably said that before in this study, than it is today as we begin a little short study of the book of Ecclesiastes. Today I'm going to invite you to go with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. It's here in this passage that we're reminded that life comes with challenges, and many of those challenges are beyond our control. But even so, we have hope, because the God that we serve is sovereign over all of his creation. And we have hope because we know that God is at work even when we can't see it. The passage also reminds us that life has seasons to it, seasons of blessing, seasons of challenge. But in each of those seasons of life, God reveals to us who he is. We see his nature, we see his character. And the book of Ecclesiastes is a book that's about perspective of those things that we face in life, the challenges, the seasons, the blessings. And as we watch God work, it's all about perspective. It's about taking a long look at life, but not from the usual vantage point. This book, it's a book that questions the view from the valley, but attempts to help us get a big picture of life. It's also a book that almost didn't make it into the Bible that you and I read today. It's skeptical in nature, and it runs against the grain of who God's people are, optimistic people filled with hope. But it was its connection to things like the book of Proverbs and Solomon and other things that gave it its credibility, and so it is here for us to read. Also, I wanted to note that modern day scholars often refer to the writer of this book as the preacher teacher. But for our study, we're going to take the vantage point that the writer of this book is Solomon. And so you'll hear that referenced occasionally in our study today. So here's where we begin. This book is a real look at life. And we start with Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. And when I read it, you'll see the reality, the honesty of our writer. Here's what he says. There's a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet, no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Well, our writer today begins with a conversation about 1960s folk music and a song by the title Turn, Turn, Turn by Peter Seeger and performed by the Byrds. And why we note that song is that it contains language from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It was a song written during a disruptive time in American culture. And the biblical words and the images that it creates invites its listeners to reflect on the passage of time, the reality of change, and the challenge of choice. Well, today we live in a world that is trying to make itself wealthy, to consume itself to be happy, and to war itself to peace. And lots of people are asking the question, is this all there is? And in the midst of that, maybe asking some really tough questions about, well, who am I and why am I here and where am I going? What really matters, and does my life count? Well, I think the book of Ecclesiastes is going to help us answer some of those questions today. But perhaps there's nothing more striking in this book than the fact that the writer makes this statement: there is a time for everything. And then he goes on to sort of unpack it. We've already read those words, but they're worth repeating because this is the reality of the life we live, the harsh reality, the reality of this life, maybe better to say. And here's what he said: there's a time for birth and a time for death, a time for planting and a time for uprooting, a time for killing and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and building, a time for weeping and laughing, a time for mourning and dancing, a time for scattering stones and gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for holding back from embracing, a time for searching and a time for giving up, a time for keeping and a time for throwing away, a time for tearing and a time for mending, a time for keeping silent and a time for speaking, a time for hate and a time for love and a time for hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Wow, what a list that is. It's a list that's meant to represent life here on earth, the full range of human events and experiences and emotions. And he's got our attention because we know that's real stuff. You see, what he goes on to say about God and meaning and godliness and meaninglessness is against this backdrop of ordinary, mundane, demanding, challenging, up and down, back and forth, day in and day out realities of life as a mortal here on this earth. Life is always changing. If you don't like how it is right now, kind of like the weather in South Carolina, hang on for a little while, it'll change pretty soon. So those could be words of encouragement if you think about it, you're in a difficult moment. It won't last forever. Something more pleasing will take place. But here's what we know: nothing stays the same. Change is inevitable, and life sort of has a rhythm to it. But perspective, remember this book is about perspective. What we just said is that what he goes on to say about God and meaning and godliness and meaninglessness is against that backdrop of everyday life. But we begin to discover there's some significance in perspective. So how we read these words can either be good news or bad news, depending on whether or not there is anything meaningful or significant in the rhythms of our life. Much of the book of Ecclesiastes highlights the bad news. Throughout the book, we would hear words, if we were to read all of Ecclesiastes, things like meaningless, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. When I survey all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. So without God, or without God's perspective, that's kind of the logical conclusion, that pain and futility are just a part of life. So this writer, he's brutally honest about that fact. But there's another perspective, an alternative perspective, that's brought out in the book of Ecclesiastes that gives place to human meaning and significance. And it's notable that at the center of that conversation is time. The very thing that started out in the passage as almost problematic. There's a time for everything, and then there's this list. But this alternate perspective, the first is sort of human-based, just how we see things in the moment. There's a God perspective. That time is not simply this trigger of back and forth, up and down, and just this mundane cycle of life. But in the end, ultimately, God makes something beautiful out of the things that we face. One of the things he says is he talks about how God plants eternity in the human heart so that this is not all there is. We have something that we hope for. The Apostle Paul describes it like this to the Corinthians. It's the same kind of thing that the book of Ecclesiastes, the passage we read today, closes with. Here's what he says. Paul says, "What no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. These are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit." That's 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. So notice these perspectives. In bad news, human-only perspective, we only see what's immediately in front of us. We see the moment. Seemingly, life again is this cycle of seasons of events that are out of control that we can't do anything about it. But by contrast, in the good news, God-based perspective, we are participants in what God is doing. And he's moving us toward a meaningful end. The seemingly constant change of human life is actually contained within God's action. And he has a plan, and what he is doing will endure forever. So finding satisfaction in life, meaning and purpose and significance, is not inevitable. It's not in the logical conclusions of the realities of life that we face here in this mortal body. But to the contrary, it almost seems elusive. But we can find it. We can find it in who God is. And we can find it in God's perspective of life. That is his gift to us. So Ecclesiastes reminds us that our lives are made meaningful only by the goodness of God. While the things of this world, while human creativity and work and education are all important components of our life, they are not the avenues to meaning. Our lives become good and meaningful to the degree that we understand who God is and that we seek him out and that we seek to follow his ways. So perspective matters. Whether we take it from the moment and only what's in front of us, that's the human perspective, or that we take it from God's perspective and we see things uniquely different. My prayer is today that you will see life from God's perspective. God bless you. See you next Sunday.